Everyone loves to listen to a good book, and there are so many wonderful ones to choose, so we decided to bring you this podcast of Stories Come to Life. Each episode features a story from either classic or modern literature, especially chosen to be interesting and exciting to hear. So sit back, relax, and listen to this story come to life. Welcome to Stories Come to Life. I am your host, Kathryn Lopez Luker. It's time for Shirley Hollister's 2-week vacation. And what an amazing opportunity is coming to their family. Mr. and Mrs. Graham have invited the Hollisters to take their daughter Elizabeth to their shore house for the month of September, while Mr. and Mrs. Graham visit out west. It will be the first time Shirley and the rest have seen the ocean, and wouldn't it be lovely for little Doris to play in the sand? Now, if only Mr. Barnard could let Shirley vacation in peace, but of course, his assignment will only take a few hours. Shirley can't pass up the opportunity to help her boss. Now sit back, relax, and listen to this story come to life. The Enchanted Barn by Grace Livingston Hill. Chapter 19. Since the pastor from the village had called upon them, the young people of the stone barn had been identified with the little white church in the valley. Shirley had taken a class of boys in the Sunday school and was playing the organ, as George had once predicted. Carol was helping the primary teacher. George was assistant librarian and secretary. Harley was in Shirley's class, and Doris was one of the primaries. Shirley had at once identified herself with the struggling little Christian Endeavor Society and was putting new life into it, with her enthusiasm, her new ideas about getting hold of the young people of the community, and her wonderful knack of getting the silent ones to take part in the meetings. She had suggested new committees, had invited the music committee to meet at her home some evening to plan out special music, and to cooperate with the social committee in planning for music at the socials. She always carried a few appropriate clippings or neatly written verses or other quotations to meeting, to slip into the hands of some who had not prepared to speak. And she saw to it that her brothers and sisters were always ready to say something. Withal, she did her part so unobtrusively that none of the old members could think that she was trying to usurp power or make herself prominent. She became a quiet power behind the powers, to whom the president and all the other officers came for advice, and who seemed always ready to help in any work or to find a way out of any difficulty. Christian Endeavor in the little white church at once took great strides after the advent of the Hollisters, and even the idlers on the street corners were moved with curiosity to drop into the twilight service of the young people and see what went on, and why everybody seemed so interested. But the secret of it all, Shirley thought, was the little 5-minute prayer service that the prayer meeting committee held in the tiny primary room just before the regular meeting. Shirley, as chairman of the prayer meeting committee, had started this little meeting, and she always came into the larger room with an exalted look upon her face and a feeling of strength in her heart from this brief speaking with her master. Shirley was somewhat aghast the next Sabbath to have Sidney Graham arrive and ask her to take a ride with him. "Why, I was just going to church," she said, half hesitating, and then smiling bravely up at him. "Besides, I have a Sunday school class. I couldn't very well leave them, you know." He looked at her for a moment thoughtfully, trying to bridge in his thoughts this difference between them. Then he said quite humbly, "Will you take me with you?" "To church?" she asked, and there was a glad ring in her voice. Would he really go to church with her? "Yes, and to Sunday school if I may. I haven't been to Sunday school in years. I'd like to go if only you'll let me." Her cheeks grew rosy. She had a quick mental picture of putting him in Deacon Pettigrew's Bible class. "I'm afraid there isn't any class you would enjoy," she began with a troubled look. "It's only a little country church, you know. They don't have all the modern system and very few teachers. I should enjoy going into your class very much if I might. Oh, mine are just boys, just little boys like Harley, said Shirley, surprised. I've been a little boy once, you know. I should enjoy it very much, said the applicant with satisfaction. Oh, but I couldn't teach you. There was dismay in her voice. Couldn't you, though? You've taught me more in the few months I've known you than I've learned in that many years from others. Try me. I'll be very good. I'll be a boy with the rest of them, and you can just forget I'm there and go ahead. I really am serious about it. I want to hear what you have to say to them. Oh, I couldn't teach with you in there, exclaimed Shirley, putting her hands on her hot cheeks and looking like a frightened little child. Indeed, I couldn't really. I'm not much of a teacher. I'm only a beginner. I shouldn't know how to talk before any but children. He watched her silently for a minute, his face grave with wistfulness. Why do you teach them? He asked, rather irrelevantly. Because I want to help them to live right lives. I want to teach them how to know God. Why? So that they will know who it is that they are praying to. So that they will know that they really do have a loving Heavenly Father who will help them in times of trouble, and really at any time. So they will learn that there is a benevolent Christ who wants them to seek Him out and find Him. It was Christ's command that His disciples should give the message. I'm His disciple, so I have to tell the message. Was there any special stipulation as to whom that message should be given? Asked the young man thoughtfully. Did He say you were just to give it to those boys? Why, no, it was to be given to all the world, every creature. Shirley spoke the words hesitatingly, a dimple beginning to show in her cheek as her eyelids drooped over her shy eyes. And don't I come in on that? Asked Graham, with a twinkle that reminded Shirley of his father. Shirley had to laugh shamefacedly then. But I couldn't, said Shirley. I'd be so scared. I couldn't think of a thing to say. You're not afraid of me, Miss Shirley? You wouldn't be scared if you thought I really needed to know the message, would you? Well, I really do, as much as any of those kids. Shirley looked steadily into his earnest eyes and saw something there that steadied her nerve. The laughter died out of her own eyes, and a beautiful light of longing came into them. All right, she said, with a little lift of her chin, as if girding up her strength to the task. You may come, and I'll do the best I can, but I'm afraid it will be a poor best. I've only a little story to tell them this morning. Please give them just what you had intended. I want the real thing, just as a boy would get it from you. Will the rest of them come in the car with us? Shirley was very quiet during the ride to church. She let the rest do all the talking, and she sat looking off at the woods and praying for help, trying to calm the flutter of her frightened heart, trying to steady her nerves and brace herself to teach the lesson just as she had intended to teach it. She watched him furtively during the opening exercises, the untrained singing, the monotonous prayer of an old farmer elder, the dry platitudes of the Sunday school superintendent. But he sat respectfully listening, taking it all for what it was worth, the best service these people knew how to render to their Maker. Somehow her heart had gained the strength she needed from the prayers she breathed continually, and when the time for teaching the lesson arrived, she came to her class with quietness. There was a little awe upon the boys because of the stranger in their midst. They did not fling the hymn books down with a noisy thud, nor send the lesson leaves flying like winged darts across the room, quite so much as they were wont to do. They looked askance at Harley, who sat proudly by the visitor, supplying him with Bibles, hymn books, lesson leaves, and finding the place for him officiously. But Graham sat among the boys without ostentation, and made as little of his own presence as possible. He smiled at them now and then, put a handful of silver into the collection envelope when they would have passed him by, and promised a ride to one fellow who ventured to ask him hoarsely if that was his car outside the church. Shirley had made up her mind to forget as far as she could the presence of the visitor in the class, and to this end she fixed her eyes upon the worst little boy present, the boy who got up all the disturbances and made all the noises, and was the most adorable, homely, sturdy young imp the Valley Church could produce. He sat straight across from her, while Graham was at the side, and she could see in Jack's eye that he meant mischief if he could overcome his awe of the stranger. So before Jack could possibly get started, she began her story and told it straight to Jack, never taking her eyes from his face from start to finish. And before she was halfway through, she had her little audience enthralled. It was a story of the Bible, told in modern setting, and told straight to the heart of a boy who was the counterpart in his own soul of the man whom Christ cured and forgave. What Graham was thinking or looking, Shirley did not know. She had literally forgotten his existence after the first few minutes. She had seen the gleam of interest in the eyes of the boy Jack. She knew that her message was going home to a convicted young soul, and that he saw himself and his own childish sins in the sinful life of the hero of her tale. Her whole soul was bent on making him see the Savior who could make that young life over. Not until the story was almost finished did any one of the listeners, unless perhaps Harley, who was used to such story recitals, have a suspicion that the story was just a plain, ordinary chapter of the Bible. Then, suddenly one of the older boys broke forth, "Aw, gee, that's just the man in the Bible let down through the roof." There was a slight stir in the class at the discovery, as it dawned upon them that the teacher had put one over on them again. But the interest, for the most part, was sustained breathlessly, until the superintendent's bell rang, and the heads drew together in an absorbed group around her for the last few sentences, spoken in a lower tone because the general hum of teaching in the room had ceased. Graham's face was very grave and thoughtful as she finished and slipped away from them to take her place at the little organ. One could see that it was not in the teacher alone, but in her message as well that he was interested. The boys all had that subdued, half-ashamed, half-defiant look that boys have when they've been caught looking serious. Each boy frowned and studied his toes, or hunted assiduously in his hymn book to hide his confusion. And the class in various keys lifted up assertive young voices vigorously in the last hymn. Graham sat beside Shirley in the little crowded church during the rather monotonous service. The regular pastor, who was a good spiritual man, if not a brilliant one, and gave his congregation solid, practical sermons, was on his vacation, and the pulpit was supplied by a young theologue who was so new to his work that his sermon was a rather involved effort. But so strong was the power of the Sunday school lesson to which he had just listened that Graham felt as if he were sitting in some hallowed atmosphere. He did not see the red-faced, embarrassed young preacher, nor notice his struggles to bring forth his message bravely. He saw only the earnest-faced young teacher as she spoke the words of life to her boys, saw the young imp faces of her boys softened and touched by the story she told, saw that she really believed and felt every word she spoke, and knew that there was something in it all that he wanted. The seat was crowded and the day was warm, but the two who looked over the same hymn book did not notice it. The soft air came in from the open window beside them, breathing sweet clover and wild honeysuckle, and the meadowlarks sang their songs, and made it seem just like a little bit of heaven. Shirley's muslin frills trembled against Graham's hand as she reached to catch a fluttering leaf of the hymn book that the wind had caught. Once her hand brushed the coat sleeve beside her as they turned the page, and she felt the soft texture of the fine dark blue goods with a pleasant sense of the beautiful and fitting. It thrilled her to think he was standing thus beside her in her own church. yielding himself to the same worship with her in the little common country congregation. It was wonderful, beautiful, and to have come to her. She glanced shyly up at him, so handsome, standing there singing, his hand almost touching hers, holding the book. He felt her glance and answered it with a look and a smile, their eyes holding each other for just the fraction of a second, in which some inner thought was interchanged, some question asked and answered by the invisible flash of their heartbeats, a mutual joining in the spiritual service. And then, half frightened, Shirley dropped her eyes to the page, and the soft roses stole into her cheeks again. She felt as if she had seen something in his eyes and acknowledged it in her own, as if she had inadvertently shown him her heart in that glance. And that heart of hers was leaping and bounding with an uncontrollable joy, while her conscience sought by every effort to get it in control. What nonsense, it said. What utter folly to make so much of his coming to church with her once, to allow her soul to get into such a flutter over a man who had no more idea of noticing her or caring for her than he had for a bird on the tree. And with all the tumult in her heart, she did not even see the envious glances of the village maidens who stared and stared with all their might at the handsome man who came to church in an expensive car and brought the girl who lived in a barn. Shirley's social position went up several notches, and she never even knew it. In fact, she was becoming a great puzzle to the residents of Glenside. It was good to know that for once the shabby collection box of the little church was borne back to the altar laden with a goodly bill, put in with so little ostentation that one might have judged it but a penny looking on, even though a penny would have made more noise in the unlined wooden box. After the service was over, Graham went out with the children, while Shirley lingered to play over an accompaniment for a girl who was going to sing at the Vesper service that afternoon. He piled all the children in the back seat of the car, put the boy he had promised to ride in the seat beside him, took a spin about the streets, and was back in front of the church by the time Shirley came out. Then that foolish heart of hers had to leap again at the thought that he had saved the front seat for her. The boy descended as if he had been caught up into heaven for a brief space, and would never forget it the rest of his life. There was that same steady look of trust and understanding in Graham's eyes whenever he looked at her on the way home, and once, while the children were talking together in the back seat, he leaned toward her and said in a low tone, "I wonder if you'll let me take you away for a little while this afternoon, to a quiet place I know, where there's a beautiful view, and let us sit and talk. There are some things I want to ask you about what you said this morning. I was very much interested in it all, and I'm deeply grateful that you let me go. Now will you go with me? I'll bring you back in time for the Christian Endeavor service, and you see in the meantime, I'm inviting myself to dinner. Do you think your mother will object?" What was there for Shirley to do but accept this alluring invitation? She did not believe in going off on pleasure excursions on the Sabbath, but this request that she ride to a quiet place out of doors for a religious talk could not offend her strongest sense of what was right on the Sabbath day. And surely, if the Lord had a message for her to bear, she must bear it to whomsoever he sent. This, then, was this man's interest in her, that she had been able to make him think of God. A glad elation filled her heart. Something deep and true stirred within her and lifted her above the thought of self, like a blessing from on high. To be asked to bring light to a soul like this one, this was honor indeed. This was an answer to her prayer of the morning, that she might fulfill God's pleasure with the lesson of the day. The message then had reached his soul. It was enough. She would think no more of self. Yet, whenever she looked at him and met that smile again, she was thrilled with joy in spite of herself. At least there was a friendliness here beyond the common acquaintance, a something that was true, deep, lasting, even though worlds should separate them in the future. A something built on a deep understanding, sympathy, and common interests. Well, so be it. She would rejoice that it had been given her to know one man of the world in this beautiful way, and her foolish little human heart should understand what a high, true thing this was that must not be misunderstood. So she reasoned with herself, and watched him during the dinner, among the children, out in the yard among the flowers and animals, everywhere. He seemed so fine and splendid, so far above all other men that she had ever met. And her mother, watching, trembled for her when she saw her happy face. "Do you think you ought to go with him, daughter?" she asked with troubled eyes when they were left alone for a moment after dinner. "You know it is the Sabbath, and you know his life is very different from ours." "Mother, he wants to talk about the Sunday school lesson this morning," said Shirley shyly. "I guess he's troubled, perhaps, and wants me to help him. I guess he has never thought much about religious things." "Well, daughter dear, be careful. Do all you can for him, of course, but remember, don't let your heart stray out of your keeping. He is very attractive, dear, and very unconventional for a wealthy man. I think he is true and wouldn't mean to trifle, but he wouldn't realize." "I know, Mother. Don't you be afraid for me," said Shirley, with a lofty look, half of exultation, half of proud self-command. He took her to a mossy place beside a little stream, where the light filtered down through the lacy leaves flecking the bank, and braided golden currents in the water, with green and purple hazy hills in the distance, and just enough seclusion for a talk, without being too far away from the world. "My little sister says that you people have a real God," he said, when she was comfortably fixed with cushions from the car at her back against a tall tree trunk. "She says you seem to realize his presence. I don't know just how to say it, but I'd like to know if this is so. I'd like to know what makes you different from other girls, and your home different from most of the homes I know. I'd like to know if I may have it too." That was the beginning. Shirley, shy as a bird at first, having never spoken on such subjects except to children, yet being very well versed in the Scriptures, and feeling her faith with every atom of her being, drew out her little Bible that she had slipped into her pocket when they started, and plunged into the great subject. Never had preacher more earnest listener, or more lovely temple in which to preach. And if sometimes the young man's thoughts for a few moments strayed from the subject to rest his eyes in tenderness upon the lovely face of the young teacher, and longed to draw her into his arms and claim her for his own, he might well have been forgiven. For Shirley was very fair, with the light of other worlds in her face, her eyes all sparkling with her eagerness, her lips aglow with words that seemed to be given her for the occasion. She taught him simply, not trying to go into deep arguments, but urging the only way she knew, the way of taking Christ's promise on its face value, the way of being willing to do his will, trusting it to him to reveal himself, and the truth of the doctrine, and make the believer sure. They talked until the sun sunk low, and the calling of the woodbirds warned them that the endeavor hour was near. Before they left the place, he asked her for the little Bible, and she laid it in his hand with joy that he wanted it, that she was chosen to give him a gift so precious. "It's all marked up," she said apologetically. "I always mark the verses I love or have had some special experience with." "It will be that much more precious to me," he said gently, fingering the leaves reverently. And then he looked up and gave her one of those deep looks that seemed to say so much to her heart. And all at once she realized that she was on earth once more, and that his presence and his look were very precious to her. Her cheeks grew pink with the joy of it, and she looked down in confusion and could not answer, so she rose to her feet. But he, springing at once to help her up, kept her hand for just an instant with earnest pressure, and said in deeply moved tones, "You don't know what you've done for me this afternoon, my friend." He waited with her hand in his an instant, as if he were going to say more, but had decided it were better not. The silence was so compelling that she looked up into his eyes, meeting his smile, and that said so many things her heart went into a tumult again, and could not quite come to itself all through the Christian Endeavor service. On the way home from the church, he talked a little about her vacation, when it came, how long it lasted, what she would do with it. Just as they reached home, he said, "I hope you will pray for me, my friend." There was something wonderful in the way he said that word, friend. It thrilled her through and through as she stood beside the road and watched him speed away into the evening. "My friend, I hope you will pray for me, my friend." It sang a glory song down her heart as she turned to go in, with the vivid glory of the sunset on her face. Chapter 20. The cement floor had been down a week and was hard as a rock, when one day 2 or 3 wagon loads of things arrived with a note from Mr. Graham to Mrs. Hollister, to say that he would be glad if these might be stored in one corner of the basement floor, where they would be out of her way, and not take up too much room. Harley and George went down to look them over that evening. "He said something about some things being taken from the office building," said Harley, kicking a pile of iron pipes with his toe. "These don't look like any old things that have been used," said George thoughtfully. "They look perfectly new." Then he studied them a few minutes more from another angle, and shut his lips judiciously. He belonged to the boy species that has learned to shut up and saw wood, whatever that expression may mean. If anything was to come out of that pile of iron in the future, he did not mean to break confidence with anybody's secrets. He walked away whistling and said nothing further about them. The next day, Mrs. Graham came down upon the Hollisters in her limousine, and in an exquisite toilette of organdy and ribbons. She was attended by Elizabeth, wild with delight over getting home again. She begged Mrs. Hollister very charmingly and sincerely to take care of Elizabeth for 3 or 4 weeks, while she and her husband were away, and to take her entire family down to the shore and occupy their cottage, which had been closed all summer and needed opening and airing. She said that nothing would please Elizabeth so much as to have them all her guests during September. The maids were there, with nothing to do but look after them, and would just love to serve them. It really would be a great favor to her if she could know that Elizabeth was getting a little salt air under such favorable conditions. She was so genuine in her request, and suggested so earnestly that Shirley and George needed the change during their vacation, and could just as well come down every night and go up every morning for a week or 2 more after the vacations were over, that Mrs. Hollister actually promised to consider it and talk it over with Shirley when she came home. Elizabeth and Carol nearly went into spasms of joy over the thought of all they could do down at the shore together. When Shirley came home, she found the whole family quite upset discussing the matter. Carol had brought out all the family wardrobe, and was showing how she could wash this and dye that, and turn this skirt upside down, and put a piece from the old waist in there to make the lower part flare. And Harley was telling how he could get the man next door to look after the hens and pigeons, and there was nothing needing much attention in the garden now, for the corn was about over except the last picking, which wasn't ripe yet. Mrs. Hollister was saying that they really ought to stay at home and look up another place to live during the winter, and Carol was pleading that another place would be easier found when the weather was cooler anyway, and that Shirley was just awfully tired and needed a change. Shirley's cheeks grew pink in spite of the headache, which she had been fighting all day when she heard of the invitations, and sat down to think it out. Was this, then, another of the kind schemes of her kind friend to make the way easier for her? What right had she to take all this? Why was he doing it? Why were the rest of the family? Did they really need someone to take care of Elizabeth? But of course it was a wonderful opportunity, and one that her mother at least should not let slip by. And Doris! Think of Doris playing in the sand at the seaside. Supper was flung onto the table that night, any way it happened, for they were all too excited to know what they were about. Carol got butter twice and forgot to cut the bread, and Harley poured milk into the already filled water pitcher. They were even too excited to eat. Graham arrived with Elizabeth early in the morning to add his pleading to his mother's, and before he left, he had succeeded in getting Mrs. Hollister's promise that she would go. Shirley's vacation began the 1st of September, and George had asked for his at the same time, so that they could enjoy it together. Each had 2 weeks. Graham said that the cost of going back and forth to the city for the 2 would be very little. By the next morning, they had begun to say what they would take along, and to plan what they would do with the dog. It was all very exciting. There was only a week to get ready, and Carol wanted to make bathing suits for everybody. Graham came again that night with more suggestions. There were plenty of bathing suits down at the cottage of all sizes and kinds. No need to make them. The dog, of course, was to go along. He needed the change as much as anybody, and they needed him there. That breed of dog was a great swimmer. He would take care of the children when they went in bathing. How would Mrs. Hollister like to have one of the old Graham servants come over to sleep at the barn and look after things while they were gone? The man had really nothing to do at home while everybody was away, as the whole corps of servants would be there, and this one would enjoy coming out to the country. He had a brother living on a place about a mile away. As for the trip down there, Graham would love to take them all in the big touring car with Elizabeth. He had been intending to take her down that way, and there was no reason in the world why they should not all go along. They would start Saturday afternoon as soon as Shirley and George were free, and be down before bedtime. It would be cool and delightful journeying at that hour, and a great deal pleasanter than the train. So one by one, the obstructions and hindrances were removed from their path, and it was decided that the Hollisters were to go to the seashore. At last the day came. Shirley and George went off in the morning, shouting last directions about things. They were always having to go to their work, whatever was happening. It was sometimes hard on them, particularly this day when everything was so delightfully exciting. The old Graham servant arrived about 3 o'clock in the afternoon, and proved himself invaluable in doing the little last things without being told. Mrs. Hollister had her first gleam of an idea of what it must be to have plenty of perfectly trained servants about to anticipate one's needs. He entered the barn as if barns were his native heath, and moved about with the ease and unobtrusiveness that marks a perfect servant, but with none of the hauteur and disdain that many of those individuals entertain toward all whom they consider poor or beneath them in any way. He had a kindly face, and seemed to understand just exactly what was to be done. Things somehow moved more smoothly after he arrived. At 4 o'clock came Graham with the car, and a load of long linen dust cloaks and veils. The Hollisters donned them, and bestowed themselves where they were told. The servants stowed away the wraps and suitcases. Star mounted the seat beside Harley, and they were ready. They turned to look back at the barn as the car started. The old servant was having a little trouble with the big door, trying to shut it. "That door is a nuisance," said Graham as they swept away from the curb. "It must be fixed. It's no fit door for a barn, anyway." Then they curved up around Allister Avenue and left the barn far out of sight. They were going across country to the Graham home to pick up Elizabeth. It was a wonderful experience for them, that beautiful ride in the late afternoon, And when they swept into the great gates and up the broad drive to the Graham mansion, Mrs. Hollister was quite overcome with the idea of being beholden to people who lived in such grandeur as this. To think she had actually invited their son to dine in a barn with her! Elizabeth came rushing out eagerly, all ready to start, and she climbed in beside Carol. Even George, who was usually silent when she was about, gave her a grin of welcome. The father and mother came out to say goodbye, gave them good wishes, and declared they were perfectly happy to leave their daughter in such good hands. Then the car curved about the great house, among tennis courts, greenhouses, garage, stable, and what-not, and back to the pike again, leaping out upon the perfect road as if it were as excited as the children. 2 more stops to pick up George, who was getting off early, and Shirley, who was through at 5 o'clock, and then they threaded their way out of the city, across the ferry, through another city, and out into the open country, dotted all along the way with clean, pretty little towns. They reached a lovely grove at sundown and stopped by the way to have supper. Graham got down and made George help him get out the big hamper. There was a most delectable lunch, sandwiches of delicate and unknown condiments, salad as bewildering, soup that had been kept hot in a thermos bottle, served in tiny white cups, iced tea and ice cream meringues from another thermos compartment, and plenty of delicious little cakes, olives, nuts, bonbons, and fruit. It seemed a wonderful supper to them all, eaten out there under the stars, with the birds beginning their vesper songs, and the stars peeping out slyly. Then they packed up their dishes and hurried on their beautiful way, a silver thread of a moon coming out to make the scene more lovely. Doris was almost asleep when at last they began to hear the booming of the sea and smell the salt breeze as it swept back inland. But she roused up and opened wide, mysterious eyes, peering into the new darkness and murmuring softly, "I want to see the ocean. I want to see the great big water." Stiff, bewildered, filled with ecstasy, they finally unloaded in front of a big white building that looked like a hotel. They tried to see into the deep, mysterious darkness across the road, where boomed a great voice that called them, and where dashing spray loomed high like a waving phantom hand to beckon them now and again, and far-moving lights told of ships and a world beyond the one they knew, a wide, limitless thing like eternity, universe, chaos. With half-reluctant feet, they turned away from the mysterious, unseen lure and let themselves be led across an unbelievably wide veranda into the great bright light of a hall, where everything was clean and shining, and a great fireplace filled with friendly flames gave cheer and welcome. The children stood bewildered in the brightness, while 2 strange serving-maids unfastened their wraps and dust cloaks and helped them take off their hats. Then they all sat around the fire, for Graham had come in by this time, and the maids brought trays of some delicious drink with little cakes and crackers, and tinkling ice, and straws to drink with. Doris almost fell asleep again, and was carried upstairs by Shirley, and put to bed in a pretty white crib she was too sleepy to look at, while Carol, Elizabeth, George, and Harley went with Graham across the road to look at the black, yawning cavern they called Ocean, and to have the shore lighthouses pointed out to them and named one by one. They were all asleep at last, a little before midnight, in spite of the excitement over the spacious rooms and who should have which. Think of it! 30 rooms in the house, and every one as pretty as every other one. What luxury! And nobody to occupy them but themselves. Carol could hardly get to sleep. She felt as if she had dropped into a novel and was living it. When Graham came out of his room the next morning, The salt breeze swept invitingly through the hall and showed him the big front door of the upper piazza open, and someone standing in the sunlight, with light, glowing garments, gazing at the sea in rapt enjoyment. Coming out softly, he saw that it was Shirley, dressed in white, with a ribbon of blue at her waist, and a soft pink color in her cheeks, looking off to sea. He stood for a moment to enjoy the picture, and said in his heart that sometime, if he got his wish, he would have her painted so, by some great artist, with just that little simple white dress and blue ribbon, her round white arm lifted up, her small hand shading her eyes, the sunlight burnishing her brown hair into gold. He could scarcely refrain from going to her and telling her how beautiful she was. But when he stepped quietly up beside her, only his eyes spoke, and brought the color deeper into her cheeks, and so they stood for some minutes, looking together and drawing in the wonder of God's sea. "This is the first time I've ever seen it, you know," spoke Shirley at last, "and I'm so glad it was on a Sunday morning. It will always make the day seem more holy, and the sea more wonderful to think about. I like best things to happen on Sunday, don't you? Because that is the best day of all." Graham looked at the sparkling sea, all azure and pearls, realized the Sabbath quiet, and marveled at the beauty of the soul of the girl, even as her feeling about it all seemed to enter into and become a part of himself. "Yes, I do," he said. "I never did before, but I do now. And I always shall," he added under his breath. That was almost as wonderful a Sabbath as the one they had spent in the woods a couple of weeks before. They walked and talked by the sea, and they went to a little Episcopal chapel, where the windows stood open for the chanting of the waves and the salt of the breeze to come in freely. And then they went out and walked by the sea again. Wherever they went, whether resting in some of the many big rockers on the broad verandas, or walking on the hard, smooth sand, or sitting in some cozy nook by the waves, they felt the same deep sympathy, the same conviction that their thoughts were one, the same wonderful thrill of the day and each other's nearness. Somehow in the new environment, Shirley forgot for a little that this young man was not of her world, that he was probably going back soon to the city to enter into a whirl of the winter's season in society, that other girls would claim his smiles and attentions, and she would likely be forgotten. She lost the sense of it entirely, and companioned with him as joyously as if there had never been anything to separate them. Her mother, looking on, sighed, feared, smiled, and sighed again. They walked together in the sweet darkness beside the waves that evening, and he told her how, when he was a little boy, he wanted to climb up to the stars and find God. But later, how he thought the stars and God were myths like Santa Claus, and that the stars were only electric lights put up by men and lighted from a great switch every night. And when they didn't shine, somebody had forgotten to light them. He told her many things about himself that he had never told to anyone before, and she opened her shy heart to him too. Then they planned what they would do next week when he came back. He told her he must go back to the city in the morning to see his father and mother off and attend to a few matters of business at the office. It might be 2 or 3 days before he could return, but after that he was coming down to take a little vacation himself if she didn't mind, and they would do a lot of delightful things together, row, fish, go crabbing, and he would teach her to swim and show her all the walks and favorite places where he used to go as a boy. Reluctantly they went in, his fingers lingering about hers for just a second at the door, vibrating those mysterious heartstrings of hers again, sweeping dearest music from them, and frightening her with joy that took half the night to put down. Chapter 21. Sidney Graham went back to the city the next morning. They all stood out on the piazza to watch the big car glide away. Doris stood on the railing of the piazza with Shirley's arm securely about her, and waved a fat little hand. Then, with a pucker of her lip, she demanded, "Why does my Mr. Graham go away? I don't want him to go away. I want him to stay with me always. Don't you, Shirley?" Shirley, with glowing cheeks, turned from watching the retreating car and put her little sister down on the floor suddenly. "Run and get your hat, Doris, and we'll take a walk on the sand," she said, smiling alluringly at the child, till the baby forgot her grievance and beamed out with answering smiles. Oh, that was a wonderful day. They all took a walk on the sand first, George pushing his mother in a big wheeled chair belonging to the cottage. Elizabeth was guide and pointed out all the beauties of the place, telling eager bits of reminiscence from her childhood memories, to which even George listened attentively. From having been only tolerant of her, George had now come to look upon Elizabeth as a good scout. When Mrs. Hollister grew tired, they took her back to the cottage and established her in a big chair with a book. Then they all rushed off to the bathhouses and presently emerged in bathing suits. Doris looking like a little sprite in her scarlet flannel scrap of a suit, her bright hair streaming and her beautiful baby arms and legs flashing white like a cherub's in the sunlight. They came back from their dip in the waves, hungry and eager, to the wonderful dinner that was served so exquisitely in the great cool dining room, from the windows of which they could watch the lazy ships sailing in the offing. Doris fell asleep over her dessert and was tumbled into the hammock to finish her nap. Carol and Elizabeth and the boys started off crabbing, and Shirley settled herself in another hammock with a pile of new magazines about her, and prepared to enjoy a whole afternoon of laziness. It was so wonderful to lie still, at leisure and unhurried, with all those lovely magazines to read, and nothing to disturb her. She leaned her head back and closed her eyes for a minute, just to listen to the sea, and realize how good it was to be here. Back in her mind there was a pleasant consciousness of the beautiful yesterday, and the beautiful tomorrows that might come when Sidney Graham returned. But she would not let her heart dwell upon them. That would be humoring herself too much, and perhaps give her a false idea of things. She simply would not let this wonderful holiday be spoiled by the thought that it would have to end some day, and that she would be back at the old routine of care and worry once more. She was roused from her reverie by the step of the postman, bringing a single letter. For her! It was addressed in an unknown hand, and was in a long fat envelope. Wonderingly, she opened it, and found inside a bank book and blank check-book, with a little note on which was written, "Dear young lady, this is just a trifle of that present we were talking about the other day that belongs to you. It isn't all by any means, but we'll see to the rest later. Spend this on chocolates or chewing gum or frills or whatever you like, and have a good time down at the shore. You're a bully young woman and deserve everything nice that's going. Don't be too serious, Miss Shirley. Play a little more. Your elderly friend, Walter K. Graham." In the bank book was an entry of $5,000 on check account. Shirley held her breath and stared at the figures with wide eyes, then slipped away and locked herself in the big white room that was hers. Kneeling down by the bed, she cried and prayed and smiled all in one, and thanked the Lord for making people so kind to her. After that, she went to find her mother. Mrs. Hollister was sitting on the wide upper piazza in a steamer chair, looking off to sea, and drawing in new life at every breath. Her book was open on her lap, but she had forgotten to read in the joy of all that was about her. To tell the truth, she was wondering if the dear father who was gone from them knew of their happy estate, and thinking how glad he would be for them if he did. She read the letter twice before she looked at the bank book with its astonishing figures, and heard again Shirley's tale of the happening in the office the morning of the arrest. Then she read the letter once more. "I'm just not sure, daughter," she said at last with a smile, "what we ought to do about this. Are you?" "No," said Shirley, smiling. "I suppose I'll give it back. But wasn't it wonderful of him to do it? Isn't it grand that there are such men in the world?" "It certainly is, dear. And I'm glad my little girl was able to do something that was of assistance to him, and that she has won her way into his good graces so simply and sweetly. But I'm not so sure what you ought to do. Hadn't we better pray about it a bit before you decide? How soon ought you to write to him? It's too late to reach him before he leaves for California, isn't it?" "Oh, yes, he's just about starting now," said the girl. "Don't you suppose he's planned it, so that I couldn't answer right away? I don't know his address. I can't do a thing till I find out where to write. I wouldn't like to send it to the office, because they would probably think it was business, and his secretary might open it." "Of course. Then we'll just pray about it, shall we, dear? I'm not just sure in my mind whether it's a well-meant bit of charity that we ought to hand back, with sincere thanks, or whether it's God's way of rewarding my little girl for her faithfulness and her quickness of action. Our Father knows we have been, and still are, in a hard place. He knows that we have need of all these things that money has to buy. You really did a good thing and saved Mr. Graham from a great loss, and perhaps he is the kind of man who would feel a great deal happier if he shared a little of it with you, was able to make some return for what you did for him. However, $5,000 is a great deal of money for a brief service. What do you think, dear?" "I don't know, Mother dear. I'm all muddled just as you say, but I guess it will come right if we pray about it. Anyhow, I'm going to be happy over his thinking of me, whether I keep it or not." Shirley went thoughtfully back to her hammock and her magazines, a smile on her lips, a dream in her eyes. She found herself wondering whether Sidney Graham knew about this money, and what he would wish her to do about it. Then suddenly she cast the whole question from her and plunged into her magazine, wondering why it was that almost any question that came into her mind promptly got around and entangled itself with Mr. Sidney Graham. What did he have to do with it anyway? The magazine story was very interesting, and Shirley soon forgot everything else in the pleasure of surrendering herself to the printed page. An hour went by, another passed, and Shirley was still oblivious to all about her. Suddenly she became aware of a boy on a bicycle, riding almost up to the very steps and whistling vigorously. "Miss Shirley Hollister here?" he demanded, as he alighted on one foot on the lower step, the other foot poised for flight, as soon as his errand should have been performed. "Why, yes," said Shirley, startled, struggling to her feet, and letting a shower of magazines fall all about her. "Long distance wants you," he announced, looking her over apathetically. "Mr. Barnard of Philadelphia wants to talk to you." And with the final word chanted nasally, he alighted upon his obedient steed and spun away down the walk again. "But wait! Where shall I go? Where's the telephone?" "Pay station," shouted the impervious child, turning his head over his shoulder. "Drug store, 2 blocks from the post office." Without waiting to go upstairs, Shirley, whose training had been to answer the telephone at once, caught up Elizabeth's parasol that lay on a settee by the door, rumpled her fingers through her hair by way of toilette, and hurried down the steps in the direction the boy had disappeared, wondering what in the world Mr. Barnard could want of her. Was he going to call her back from her vacation? Was this perhaps the only day she would have, this and yesterday? There would always be yesterday. With a sigh she looked wistfully at the sea. If she had only known a summons was to come so soon, she would have sat and gazed all afternoon at the sea. If Mr. Barnard wanted her, of course she would have to go. Business was business, and she couldn't afford to lose her job, even with that fairy dream of 5,000 to give her credit in the bank. She knew, of course, she meant to give that back. It was hers for the day, but it could not become tangible. It was beautiful, but it was right that it must go back. And if her employer felt he must cut short her vacation, why, of course she must acquiesce, and just be glad she had had this much. Perhaps it was just as well anyway, for if Mr. Sidney Graham came down and spent a few days, there was no knowing what foolish notions her heart would take, jumping and careening the way it had been doing lately, when he just looked at her. Yes, she would go back if Mr. Barnard wanted her. It was the best thing she could do. Though perhaps he would only be calling her to ask where she had left something for which they were searching. That silly Ashton girl who took her place might not have remembered all her directions. Breathless, with possibilities crowding upon her mind, she hurried into the drugstore and sought the telephone booth. It seemed ages before the connection was made, and she heard Mr. Barnard's dry, familiar tones over the phone. "That you, Miss Hollister? This is Mr. Barnard. I'm sorry to disturb you right in the midst of your holiday, but a matter has come up that is rather serious, and I'm wondering if you could help us out for a day or two. If you would, we'd be glad to give you $50 for the extra time, and let you extend your vacation to a month instead of 2 weeks. Do you think you could spare a day or two to help us right away?" "Oh, why, yes, of course," faltered Shirley, her eyes dancing at the thought of the extra vacation and money. "Thank you, I was sure you would," said Mr. Barnard with relief in his voice. "You see, we've got that government contract. The news just came in the afternoon mail. It's rather particular business, because it has to do with matters that the government wishes to keep secret. I am to go down tomorrow morning to Washington to receive instructions, and I have permission to bring a trusted private secretary with me. Now you know, of course, that I couldn't take Miss Ashton. She wouldn't be able to do what I want done, even if she were one I could trust not to say a word about the matter. I would take Jim Thorpe, but his father has just died, and I can't very well ask him to leave. Neither can I delay longer than tomorrow. Now the question is, would you be willing to go to Washington in the morning? I have looked up the trains, and I find you can leave the shore at 8:10 and meet me in Baltimore at 10 o'clock. I will be waiting for you at the train gate. But in case we miss each other, wait in the station close to the telephone booths till I find you. We'll take the next train for Washington and be there a little before noon. If all goes well, we ought to be through our business in plenty of time to make a 4 o'clock train home. Of course, there may be delays, and it is quite possible that you might have to remain in Washington overnight, though I hardly think so. But in case you do, I'll see that you are safe and comfortable in a quiet hotel near the station where my wife's sister is staying this summer. And, of course, your expenses will all be paid. I will telegraph and have a mileage book put in at your disposal that you can call for right there in your station in the morning. Are you willing to undertake this for us? I assure you we shall not forget the service." When Shirley finally hung up the receiver and looked about the little country drugstore in wonder at herself, the very bottles on the shelves seemed to be whirling and dancing before her eyes. What strange, exciting things were happening to her, all in such breathless haste. Only one day at the shore, and a piece of another, and here she was with a trip to Washington on her hands. It certainly was bewildering to have things come in such rapid succession. She wished it had come at another time, and not just now when she had not yet got used to the great sea and the wonder of the beautiful place where they were staying. She did not want to be interrupted just yet. It would not be quite the same when she got back to it, she was afraid. But of course she could not refuse. It never entered her head to refuse. She knew enough about the office to realize that Mr. Barnard must have her. Jimmy Thorpe would have been the one to go if he were available, because he had been with Barnard and Clegg for 10 years and knew all their most confidential business. But of course, Jimmy could not go with his father lying dead and his mother and invalid sister needing him, and there was no one else but herself. She thought it all out on the way back to the cottage, with a little pang at the thought of losing the next day, and of having perhaps to stay over in Washington a day, and maybe miss the arrival of Sidney Graham, if he should come back in a day or two as he had promised. He might even come and go back again before she was able to return, and perhaps he would think her ungrateful to leave, when he had been so kind to plan all this lovely vacation for her pleasure. Then she brought herself up smartly and told herself decidedly that it was nothing to him whether she was there or not, and it certainly had no right to be anything to her. It was a good thing she was going, and would probably be a good thing for all concerned if she stayed until he went back to the city again. With this firm determination she hurried up to the veranda where her mother sat with Doris and told her the story. Mrs. Hollister looked troubled. "I'm sorry you gave him an answer, Shirley, without waiting to talk it over with me. I don't believe I like the idea of your going to a strange city all alone that way. Of course Mr. Barnard will look after you in a way, but still he's a good deal of a stranger. I do wish he had let you alone for your vacation. It seems as if he might have found somebody else to go. I wish Mr. Graham were here. I shouldn't wonder if he would suggest some way out of it for you." But Shirley stiffened into dignity at once. "Really, mother dear, I'm sure I don't see what Mr. Graham would have to say about it if he were here. I shouldn't ask his advice. You see, mother, really there isn't anybody else that could do this but Jimmy Thorpe, and he's out of the question. It would be unthinkable that I should refuse in this emergency. And you know Mr. Barnard has been very kind. Besides, think of the ducky vacation I'll have afterward, a whole month, and all that extra money. That shall go to the rent of a better house for winter. Think of it. Don't you worry, mother dear. There isn't a thing in the world could happen to me. I'll be the very most discreetest person you ever heard of. I'll even glance shyly at the White House and Capitol. Come, let's go up and get dolled up for supper. Won't the children be surprised when they hear I'm really to go to Washington? I'm so excited I don't know what to do." Mrs. Hollister said no more, and entered pleasantly into the merry talk at the table, telling Shirley what she must be sure to see at the nation's capital. But the next morning, just as Shirley was about to leave for the station, escorted by all the children, Mrs. Hollister came with a package of addressed, stamped postal cards, which she had made George get for her the night before, and put them in Shirley's bag. "Just drop us a line as you go along, dear," she said. "I'll feel happier about it to be hearing from you. Mail one whenever you have a chance." Shirley laughed as she looked at the fat package. "All those, mother dear? You must expect I'm going to stay a month. You know I won't have much time for writing, and I fully expect to be back tonight, or tomorrow at the latest." "Well, that's all right," said her mother. "You can use them another time then. But you can just put a line on one whenever it's convenient. I shall enjoy getting them, even after you get back. You know, this is your first journey out into the world alone." Shirley stooped to kiss the little mother. "All right, dear, I'll write you a serial story. Each one continued in our next. Goodbye. Don't take too long a walk today. I want you rested to hear all I have to tell when I come back tonight." Shirley wrote the first postal card as soon as she was settled in the train, describing the other occupants of the car and making a vivid picture of the landscape that was slipping by her windows. She wrote the second in the Baltimore station, after she had met Mr. Barnard, while he went to get seats in the parlor car, and she mailed them both at Baltimore. The third was written as they neared Washington, with the dim vision of the great monument dawning on her wondering sight in the distance. Her last sentence gave her first impression of the nation's capital. They had eaten lunch in the dining car, a wonderful experience to the girl, and she promised herself another postal devoted to that. But there was no time to write more after they reached Washington. She was put into a taxi and whirled away to an office where her work began. She caught glimpses of great buildings on the way and gazed with awe at the dome of the Capitol building. Mr. Barnard was kind and pointed out this and that, but it was plain his mind was on the coming interview. When Shirley sat at last in a quiet corner of a big dark office, her pen poised, her notebook ready for work, and looked at the serious faces of the men in the room, she felt as if she had been rushed through a treasure vault of glorious jewels, and then thrust into the darkness of a tomb. But presently the talk about her interested her. Things were being said about the vital interests of the country, scraps of sentences that reminded her of the trend of talk in the daily papers, and the headings of front columns. She looked about her with interest, and noted the familiarity with which these men quoted the words of those high up in authority in the government. With awe she began her work, taking down whatever Mr. Barnard dictated, her fingers flying over the tiny spaces of the notebook, in small, neat characters, keeping pace with the voices going on about her. The detail work she was setting down was not of a special interest to her, save that it was concerned with government work, for its phraseology was familiar, and a part of her daily routine office work at home. But she set every sense on the alert to get the tiniest detail and not to make the smallest mistake, understanding from the voices of the men about her that it was of vital interest to the country that this order should be filled quickly and accurately. As she capped her fountain pen and slipped the rubber band on her notebook when it was over, she heard one of the men just behind her say in a low tone to Mr. Barnard, "You're sure of your secretary, of course? I just want to give you the tip that this thing is being very closely watched. We have reason to believe there's some spying planned. Keep your notes carefully and don't let too many in on this. We know pretty well what's going on, but it's not desirable just now to make any arrests until we can watch a little longer and round up the whole party. So keep your eyes peeled and don't talk." "Oh, certainly, I quite understand," said Mr. Barnard, "and I have a most discreet secretary." And he glanced with a significant smile towards Shirley as she rose. "Of course," said the other, "she looks it," and he bowed deferentially to Shirley as she passed. She did not think of it at the time, but afterwards she recalled how in acknowledging his courtesy she had stepped back a little and almost stumbled over a page, a boy about George's age, who had been standing withdrawn into the shadow of the deep window. She remembered he had a keen, intelligent look, and had apologized and vanished immediately. A moment later it seemed to be the same boy, in blue clothes and gilt buttons, who held the outer door open for them to pass. Or was this a taller boy? She glanced again at his side face with a lingering thought of George as she paused to fasten her glove and slip her notebook into her handbag. "I think I'll put you into the taxi and let you go right back to the station while I attend to another errand over at the War Department. It won't take me long. We can easily catch that 4 o'clock train back. I suppose you're anxious to get back tonight?" "Oh, yes," said Shirley earnestly. "I must, if possible. Mother isn't well, and she worries so easily." "Well, I don't know why we can't," said Mr. Barnard. "Then perhaps you can come up to town tomorrow and type those notes for us. By the way, I guess it would be better for me to take them and lock them in the safe tonight. Oh, no, don't stop to take them out now," as Shirley began to unfasten her bag and get the notebook out. "We haven't much time if we want to catch that train. Just look after them carefully, and I'll get them when we're on the train." He helped her into the taxi, gave the order, "To the station," and touched his hat, then went rapidly over to the War Department building. No one saw a boy with a blue cap and brass buttons steal forth on a bicycle from the court just below the office, and circling about the asphalt uncertainly for a moment, shoot off across the park. Shirley sat up very straight and kept her eyes about her. She was glad they were taking another way to the station, so that she might see more. When she got there, she would write another postal, and perhaps it would go on the same train with her. It was all too short, that ride up Pennsylvania Avenue and around by the Capitol. Shirley gathered up her bag and prepared to get out reluctantly. She wished she might have just one more hour to go about, but of course that would be impossible if she wished to reach home tonight. But before the driver of the car could get down and open the door for her to get out, a boy with a bicycle slid up to the curb and, touching his gilt-button cap, respectfully said, "Excuse me, miss, but Mr. Barnard sent me after you. He says there's been some mistake, and you'll have to come back and get it corrected." "Oh," said Shirley, too surprised to think for a minute. "Oh, then please hurry, for Mr. Barnard wants to get back in time to get that 4 o'clock train." The driver frowned, but the boy stepped up and handed him something, saying, "That's all right, Joe. He sent you this." The driver's face cleared, and he started his machine again. The boy vanished into the throng. It was another of Shirley's after-memories, that she had caught a glimpse of a scrap of paper, along with the money the boy had handed the driver, and that he had stuffed it into his pocket after looking at it intently. But at the time she thought nothing of it. She was only glad that they were skimming along rapidly. This is your host, Kathryn Lopez Luker. Thank you for joining us for this episode of Stories Come to Life. Be sure to join us next time when we continue to listen to the Enchanted Barn. Please let me know how you like this story and make suggestions for others you'd like to hear. I'll talk to you again soon.